Hey, book community. It's nice to sit down and have a cup of coffee and talk about books. Well, today I wanted to talk about my favorite trilogies, and I wanted to try to use this feature that I've never used before, Premiere, so maybe we can have some conversation in the chat when this video goes live. So anyway, here's to hoping it goes well. My favorite trilogies. I have read a number of trilogies. I will say these are probably the majority of the trilogies that I have read. I started my reading journey 3 years ago. So I don't have the past experience that some other book influencers brings to this community and has a whole backlog of books that they have read and the classics and things like that. I'm trying to build what I have and what I've read. So anyway, these are the majority of the trilogies that I have read. There are a few others that I have completed that, even though they were good, most of them, they didn't make this list, didn't make my top 10. Also, I want to say this at the start, that there is a couple of trilogies that I plan to get to this year that may bump some of the ones that are lower on this list off the list or something like that. So this is a list that I'm confident with this list. I'm comfortable with this list. I like this list. However, I'll give you an example. Right now, I'm reading the First Law trilogy. I read the first book, and it was okay. It didn't knock my socks off. I didn't go into it really knowing what to expect. I thought, I was told about the character work. I was told about all of that, and that was there in the best possible way. But I didn't realize there wasn't a lot to the story itself. In my opinion, that picked up in book 2, Before They Are Hanged, and I loved that book. It was amazing, and I look forward to reading The Last Argument of Kings. And if The Last Argument of Kings is, if I feel the way about it that I felt about Before They're Hanged, it's going to be one of my favorite trilogies. I just know it will. So we'll just say to be continued on that. But for right now, these are the ones that I am confident in are my favorite trilogies to this point. So let's get started. I hope I don't spill my coffee on camera. So the first one here, and some of these you can probably see, and I hope these don't fall. The first one is Stone and Sky by Z.S. Diamante. Now, this is kind of a surprise to me. It's a surprise because before last year, I had never heard of Z.S. Diamante. He is an indie author, and I discovered him on TikTok, and he's also on Instagram, and you'll see him some on X. He has his own Discord. But first of all, I discovered him on TikTok. And some of the TikTok recommended books have been hit or miss for me at times. But he was talking about this particular book and a series that he was working on, almost completed at the time. And it sounded like it would be something right up my alley. Classic feel fantasy, clean fantasy. Of course, there's violence, but no language, no sexual situations or anything like that. So I picked up book 1, and I really enjoyed it. I think I've said this in a past video. I don't know that I would put this in one of my top books of all time as far as just this first book, but it's a good book. So good that it made me want to continue on to the next book, which was Stone and Tide. And I love Stone and Tide. I had a similar experience with Stone and Tide that I had with The Bound and the Broken when I went from book 2 to book 3 in that series. Book 3 of The Bound and the Broken not Bound and the Broken, The Faithful and the Fallen. Take 2. The Faithful and the Fallen. Book 3 was such a step up that it automatically becomes something I considered my favorite. Well, that's how this particular series went. So you have Stone and Sky, Stone and Tide, and Stone and Ruin. And it is just a fun D&D style fantasy. And I really enjoyed it. If you haven't tried that, I really hope that you will try this. Multiple POV, an adventure, mystery, all of those things go into it. And a very good trilogy. And it did make my number 10 read. For my number 9 trilogy is Icewind Dale by R.A. Salvatore. Now, I've heard other people talk about this series really for years, and it sounded interesting to me, but again, until the past 2.5 to 3 years, I really wasn't reading much. And so last year I picked the first trilogy up, Dark Elf trilogy, and I really enjoyed it. Much like the reason I enjoyed this, I find a lot of that feels a lot like this. And I enjoyed the Dark Elf trilogy. I enjoyed getting to know Drizzt. But then you get to this when you meet all of the friends and they're traveling together, and that is some of the best dynamic of this series. There's wonderful fantasy elements, fantasy animals set in a fantasy world, obviously the Forgotten Realms. Wonderful characters, and so, one thing that always stands out about this to me is I'm okay with grimdark sometimes. I'm okay with morally gray sometimes, but I don't know about you, but sometimes I just get tired of that, and I just want an old-fashioned good versus evil. The good guys are really good, the bad guys are really bad. I enjoy that. That's my go-to, and that's exactly what this was for me. I've actually recently started the next, which isn't a trilogy, it's 4 books. I've actually recently started it. Legacy of the Drow, I believe it's called. Anyway, this was really good. I enjoyed it, not just because it was a fun book, because it really spoke to me in that it's the type of story that I enjoy. So there we have it, number 9, which is Icewind Dale trilogy. Now moving on to number 8. I'm going to have a disaster here. Now I move on to number 8. And as you can already see, I picked Hero of Ages as the book I would display because it was my favorite of the trilogy, but obviously Mistborn. I have had a complicated past with Brandon Sanderson. I read several of his standalones, and I thought they were okay. They were fine. I didn't see what everybody else saw. I started reading the Mistborn trilogy, and I read the first book, and again, same experience I had with other books that I had read by him. They were okay. Yeah, the first book was okay. Then I started reading The Well of Ascension, and I wasn't feeling okay. Up to the 50% of that book, it was not what I wanted it to be personally. Of course, you don't have to write what I want, but it just wasn't what I wasn't enjoying it. So I decided to pause and move on to other things. And it was during that time that I began to say, I said on this channel, I'm sure, and on Twitter, that I think I may be finished with Brandon Sanderson. And people started telling me, hey, you need to read Stormlight Archive. You need to try the Stormlight Archive. It's totally different, better than what he has done. You just need to try it before you say you're not going to read any more Brandon Sanderson. So I did, and they were right. Books 1 through 3 will not talk about the last 2 books of that series, at least the first arc of it, but books 1 through 3 were amazing. So amazing for me that it made me want to go back and say, I need to give this another try. So I picked up right where I left off. Amazingly, a year later, I believe it was a year later after I had left off of The Well of Ascension, I picked right back up. I knew right where I was in the story. I had basic understanding of what was going on, all the moving parts. And I picked up, and I really enjoyed the second half of that book. Things really picked up for me. And then I read this book. This was one of, I have to go back and see which one. I don't remember how I numbered it, but this was high on my list for my top 10 favorite books of 2024. And that has to do, I felt like his characters, I connected better with his characters in this book than I did with any of his other books that I've read, including Stormlight Archive. I felt like the story itself, for me, was better. And then I felt like the ending of all the Sander Lanches, of all of the things coming together in the end of his story, nothing worked better for me than this. And one way that I gauge that is, how does it make me feel emotionally? It doesn't emotionally move me. All books don't emotionally move me. They make me feel certain ways, but this book had me in tears, and I was not expecting it. I don't really read a lot of spoilers. I don't really listen to a lot of book reviews before I go into a book. I don't read synopsises because I have read it in the past and I felt like I got spoiled on things, and so I've stopped reading it. So I didn't know what to expect, and it worked for me. It was great. Even though I have, once again, after the last 2 Stormlight books, I have a rocky relationship with Sanderson, this will remain one of my favorite books and number 8 on my list of trilogies. Next up, I believe this is one, yeah, Ship of Magic, the Liveship Traders by Robin Hobb. So I really had to work this out. One of the trilogies that didn't make this list, but was just off the list, was Farseer. I really enjoyed Farseer. There were some things. Book 1 of Farseer was amazing. Book 2 of Farseer, even more amazing and epic. Book 3, I had a little more of a struggle with it, but ultimately I was satisfied with that book. Assassin's Quest, I believe is what it was called. And it just missed my top 10. Well, I'm going to have a couple of these on here. I would have had 3. I'm going to have a couple. Spoiler alert. Anyway, Ship of Magic. I picked this one just because it was the first book in the series. I don't know that I really, how I rank the 3 books of the Liveship Traders. I think I enjoyed different aspects of them, some more than others, but ultimately they're pretty level on the way I look at it. There was something on Discord here recently talking about this as a trilogy, and someone said they didn't like the characters, and I got to thinking, you know what? I don't like a lot of these characters either. Some of these characters were so flawed to the point of absurdity. Just they were so flawed, but we're flawed. And I guess we can see some of ourselves and our flaws in those things, but the story sucked me in. I was never bored with it. I enjoyed all 3 books. It worked for me. There are some content issues in this book that I wish had not have been there. Some people talk about, well, things can be done in taste. I have a different opinion on that. I don't think any of those things can be done in good taste. But hey, it was still a great book. It didn't take away from my enjoyment of the book and these characters that I love to hate and I love to even be annoyed with at times. But that was okay. There were some things revealed towards the end, so I'll not talk about it, of the trilogy that I did not see coming. Other people saw coming. I didn't see coming, and it blew me away. And again, since it got that type of reaction from me, on top of how beautiful the writing is, that's one of the reasons that Robin Hobb has so many books towards the top of my list. And every time I read her every year, something that Robin Hobb has written is going to be in my top 10. I'm a sucker for beautiful prose. I enjoy to get lost, not only in the story, but in the beauty of the author's writing, and she does that for me. So we have 10, 9, 8, 7. Now we're going to 6, and you can probably already see from the top of this what it's going to be, possibly. It is I think I can say with pretty much certainty that he is my favorite modern author. He's number 1 for me. And again, I just started reading his books last year. I've been hearing for several years of how great John Gwynne is. And I've heard Philip Chase talk about some things that he told me why he thought John Gwynne would work for me, because I read Philip's books before I read John Gwynne's books. And Philip said, well, I think you would enjoy John Gwynne's books because of the things you say you like about my books. Well, I knew he was right, but I just hadn't gotten into it. So when I decided I was going to go back to Stormlight Archive and read all 5 of those books, I said, I'm also going to read all the John Gwynne books. This was starting last summer, I believe last summer, until the end of the year. And so, but I started with John Gwynne's books first. I read the Faithful and the Fallen. And I've already talked about that a little bit on this video already. I loved The Faithful and the Fallen. Malice was harder for me to get into, but I still enjoyed it enough to where I was willing to continue. And then the second book was great. And then, as I said, the third book blew me away. The fourth book continued to blow me away. And I said, I've got to get to this. I've got to get to Bloodsworn. And what can I say? It's awesome writing. The first 2 books of the Bloodsworn Saga, you get such good character moments. You get such good character development. Orca, one of the best characters that has ever been written in fantasy, along with others who really stand out in these books. Books 1 and book 2, you get such amazing action, the Viking atmosphere, the Norse-inspired atmosphere, the wars, the battles. Nobody writes battles like John Gwynne does. You get all of that, and it's just so satisfying. And then I read the last book, The Fury of the Gods. And I'll say this about The Fury of the Gods. I don't think it was my favorite book of the trilogy. I know it wasn't my favorite book of the trilogy. Book 2 was Hunger of the Gods. However, I still really appreciated it because I'm not the first one who said this. Many other book reviewers have said this. It was all action. And some people said it was all action to the point where they couldn't get connected to the characters. And I'm going to push back on that. And here's why I'm going to push back on that. You got so much character development in books 1 and book 2. If you don't just pick up book 3 and not already know something about the characters, you got so much in books 1 and book 2 that book 3 was all payoff. Book 3 was all action. Book 3, and some people didn't like that as much. I was okay with it because I got everything I needed in the first 2 books. That's why the Bloodsworn Saga, John Gwynne, is so high on my list. So that is number 6. Now we're in the top 5. I'm actually surprised that that book isn't in my top 5. But anyway, so now we're going to the top 5. I'm repeating myself. And this is another Robin Hobb book, Fool's Fate. This is the Tawny Man trilogy. I don't want to give anything away about the story for those who haven't read it. But our boy Fitz, he gets treated bad in these books. He has a rough time in the first trilogy. He has a rough time in this trilogy. But the ending of this book makes me not want to read anymore. I don't know what the strategy was in writing it that way. You have no choice. If you like Fitz, you're going to love Fitz. If you don't like him, you'll know early on that you're not going to like him because it's all from his perspective. But I continued on, and I love the character Fitz. And he has a good thing going on in this book. And Robin Hobb, why do you want to mess that up? I know I don't know how it's going to get messed up. I haven't read anything. I haven't looked at anything, but I know it's going to get messed up somehow. Let my boy be happy for a little while. Anyway, I love this trilogy. Someone made a statement that the Liveship Traders is definitely the best in the realm of the Elderlings and possibly one of the best trilogies of all time, and I'm glad they had that opinion, but for me, that can't be true. For me, as long as this trilogy exists, you have, in books 1 through 3 of Farseer, you have an obnoxious, bad decision-making, selfish Fitz. That's what he's supposed to be. I know some people have stopped reading that first trilogy just because of the decisions he makes. Well, he's a kid. He's a teenager. He's supposed to make dumb decisions. But in this, you have someone who's mature, still makes some bad decisions at times, but for the most part, he's put away the old Fitz, and he's looking, he cares about others. He cares about people he's supposed to take care of. He takes responsibility on himself. He does that in such a wonderful way, and that character development that you see from the first trilogy to this trilogy is fantastic. And as other people have said, you don't just hear it from me, Stephen King is one of the greatest character writers of all time. If you love that, you need to read Robin Hobb because she's right up there with him. So that is number 5 for me. Number 3, I don't read much historical fiction. And some people have even argued over whether or not this is actual historical fiction. I would say it probably fits best in historical fantasy. I don't think it's full epic fantasy. It's set in our world. And this is Excalibur, book 3 of the Warlord Chronicles by Bernard Cornwell. Who put me onto this book? I believe it was the Brothers Gwynn. I believe it was how much they talked about it that made me want to read this. And then there were some others on BookTube and the other social media sites that picked it up and loved it. I said, you know what, I need to read that. I love Arthurian tales. I love Arthurian legend. And so I said, I want to read that. Well, this was unlike anything I'd ever... This isn't the author you grew up with. This isn't the author that we were told about in the earlier books. This is a different take, but I think it's a fresh take. This is looking at King Arthur as if it wasn't as magical of a place and as magical of a world, and making King Arthur a lot more gray morally than he was that we would have grown up knowing him as. And so anyway, you see that, And I just fell in love with his writing. The way he tells this story from beginning to end, really through the perspective of a monk who, that monk is someone else. That monk was a had firsthand experience in Arthur's life. So we get it from his perspective towards the end of his life, telling about when he was a young man and what life was growing up around Arthur. And if you haven't read this, you need to read this. There are magical elements, but there's always an explanation. Merlin will do something, and he'll tell you that it's magic. And then someone else comes along and says, yes, but. And so I would say it leaves that open to interpretation. But this is not trying to be a fantasy book. This is just trying to tell a story from an historical point of view, historical fiction point of view. And I really enjoyed it. And this book 3, I loved book 1. I loved book 2 even more. To me, it just continued to be elevated. And that's why this became number 4 for me. My next book, and you can possibly tell what it is. I don't have a good setup for hiding these books behind anything. And it is Red Rising. Now, why is Red Rising number 3 for me? Not opposed to being higher. I loved it. I feel like it's appropriately ranked for me. And here's why I say that. Because I love epic fantasy. Epic fantasy is my thing. Epic fantasy is what I choose to read before anything else. And this feels like epic fantasy, but it's not quite epic fantasy. It's sci-fi that feels like epic fantasy. I'm not even sure if you could actually call this sci-fantasy. Maybe someone would label it that. I think you can label Star Wars sci-fantasy. I think you can label Dune sci-fantasy. They have space wizards. There's really not any space wizards in this. With all of them, there are wild animals, there are wild things take place, but they all have a basic explanation. Even if the science isn't real, they still have a basic explanation for it in this world. And let's talk about Red Rising. So this particular book was not my favorite, and it's not usually most people's favorite of the series. But the more I read in the series, book 2, book 3, then the sequel series, the more I read, the more I appreciated what Pierce Brown did. Was he 24? I think he was 24 or 26 years old when he wrote this book. And he was laying a foundation that really shows for the rest of the series. And so I say this is an achievement, this particular book. Again, I was more impressed with it the more I read of the series. Some people are book 1 people. They're book 1 guys. Book 1, if they're going to pick their favorite book in a series, it's going to be book 1 generally. I'm not that way. I tend to like middle books more. I'm just weird. I don't know. So I would say that's the same with this, but still, this is a great book. It's and when I talk about the trilogy, obviously, I'm talking about Red Rising, Golden Sun, and Morning Star, the original trilogy. Some people like to say, well, it's all one series. I feel like if a new reader who don't know anything about this goes into this thinking that all of these books are just one series, then after they finish Morning Star and move into Iron Age, they might be a little shell-shocked because there's some differences. There's some, what is it, 10 years later, or a certain amount of years later, you're going into some new things. So this original trilogy is one of my favorite of all times, as you can see, number 3, and it deserves to be there. Now I have the top 2. Number 2. I'm not going to pick this out. I'm not going to pick this out because I didn't want you to be able to look and see what it was. My number 2 is The Way of Aedan, and that's also what this is, The Way of Aedan. It's the paperback, but I wanted to display this thing. I wanted us to look and just appreciate all of the beauty and the hard work that went into this particular book. It is an amazing special edition. I am so proud of it. I still haven't figured out quite where I want to display it. That's going to take some work on my bookshelves, but this is a wonderful copy. But not only is it a wonderful copy, it is a wonderful story. And it is the beginning of... This so quickly became one of my favorite trilogies of all time. I was shocked. Book 1, I want to say, I don't remember what I know I gave the last two books, the second two books, 5 stars. I think I gave this 4 or 4.5 stars, whatever we say. There were some details that I thought may have been rushed. I remember saying it in my review that I thought some details that may have been rushed. When I went back and reread it, I didn't think they were rushed anymore. I thought they were appropriate. I thought Dayraven, who I thought was rushing into things about halfway through the book, I see why he did it anyway. And so I loved book 1. Book 2 is as much fantasy as you want it to be. It has dragons. It has so many dragons. It has epic battles. It has shield walls. I have found there are some things that I want in my stories. And probably the reason why I don't like modern fantasy told from a modern setting. I haven't really found a lot of flintlock fantasy that I love, because I love medieval style fantasy with shield walls. That's one of the reasons I love John Gwynne so much. Book 2 was great. It had every fantasy element that you would want. And then you get to the end of book 2 and you think, the story's over. In a traditional fantasy series, the story is over. What else is Philip going to do? And then you read book 3 and you've been opened up to a lot of new things, which was my favorite book of the series. Return to Aedan. Philip did some, in fact, I did a video a while back on books that impacted me the most, and that was one of those books, his entire story, but specifically that book. This quickly became one of my all-time favorite series, and I will forever be grateful for the experience that I had in this particular book. And then, as if I had to even say it, if you have listened to anything I've had to say, if you've listened to any grouping of videos, if you follow me on social media, there's one particular series that I talk about, and to this day, it's not been topped. I usually use my special edition when I talk about Lord of the Rings. I've used these, which are, I believe they're 1975 edition of the trilogy, and it's the GOAT, the greatest of all time. It's my favorite. It's not everybody's favorite, and I've had to really temper down my feelings when I hear people give criticisms with the Lord of the Rings. All books can have criticisms. This one's special to me, and I'm not going to go back into all the reasons of why it's special to me. I've mentioned that in other videos, but it is just, it's my favorite story. It is heroic fantasy. It's adventure fantasy. There's a journey. There's a goal. There's good. There's evil. There's good guys, bad guys. There's not a lot of morally grayness, and I love it. It's my favorite of all time. It will continue to be my favorite of all time, I imagine. You know, some people say, well, I'm open to finding a new favorite. Well, technically I am, but I don't believe it's going to happen. And the reason I don't believe it's going to happen is because some of the emotional things that connect me to this book. As I've said, if a book can move me emotionally, if a book can impact me in some way, it has a good chance of becoming a favorite. And no book, no novel has done it like this book. And I am forever grateful for the works of Tolkien. So thank you. I hope you were able to join in the comments and talk through this with me a little bit. These are my favorite, top 10 favorite fantasies. And who knows, maybe next year I may have some changes depending on how this year goes. But this was it for me. Thank you for joining in.